Hey there, Mr. Terry, high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher X video. All right, a couple weeks ago, I reacted for the first time to the channel Elephants in Rooms. And that video was really interesting. It was about kind of the history of Native Americans, especially kind of violence in the West. And the motive behind it was basically to talk about things that maybe don't get talked about a lot. And the video did really well, and it got a good reception from you guys. And I thought we'd dive back into the channel. And I was looking through their videos, and this one caught my eye, and I thought it'd be good to check out. It's called Japan's War Crimes. Why Did We Forget? So obviously this is in reference to World War II, probably contrasting how famous, things like the Nuremberg trials were that put surviving Nazi officials on trial for war crimes. And of course, there were significant war crimes conducted by the Japanese in World War II. So why has one narrative been kind of louder than the other? We'll see what he says. This original video is going to be linked down below. Make sure you support that, give it a view, like the channel. Let me know if you want to see more from this channel and me commenting on it. Be sure to subscribe to my new originals channel. It's down below. It's got great original history content. A lot of fun. Think you'll enjoy it. Let's get started. So we'll see how much of the Tokyo trials is referenced, as those were the similar war crime trials of the Nuremberg trials, but for the Japanese. But yeah, there's kind of a narrative, and I have some thoughts about it, about, why it gets talked so much more about what happened in Europe rather than happened in Asia. Got plenty of thoughts about it, but let's see his, and I'll tell you what I think along the way.
Nazis. They're essentially a synonym for evil. And, of course, no one's worse than Hitler. But the Japanese in World War II were every bit as horrific as the Germans, in many ways worse. Their military murdered prisoners for sport, raped hundreds of thousands of women and girls. They froze babies alive in human medical experiments.
So yeah, that's one of the craziest things is, the medical stuff. If you want to look more into it, it's very dark. You can look at called Unit 731. And I was just looking at what kind of the official, that was the official name, but it's the official name of this group, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, with its purpose as doing covert biological and chemical war research, with victims being both Chinese and Russians. Horrific stuff. You saw these kind of weird scientific experiments happening with the Nazis as well.
Yet few people even know the name of the prime minister who took them to war.
Tojo.
Hideki Tojo. And his
let's be clear though, it's a lot bigger than Tojo as well. The military of Japan was not unified like we think things are, like we see in the West, how we have this like centralized government that, has influence over the Navy and the Army and the Air Force. The Japanese military and its different branches really kind of fought and kind of operated independently. They actually had a lot of disagreements and almost like competitions almost with each other, and oftentimes didn't get along and didn't coordinate very well, which is actually really going to hurt them in the war.
People even know the name of the prime minister
major
who
player,
took them
obviously.
to war. Hideki Tojo. And his boss, Emperor Hirohito, he ended up going to Disneyland before he died. Imagine Goebbels in the teacups. I'm Ken LaCorte, and the elephant in the room is this. How did Japan escape the blame that Germany got for World War II? I've wondered about it for a long time, and I decided to dig in and see what I could learn.
Escape is an interesting way to kind of say that, because there was some manners of justice in some fashion when you're talking about war crime trials. Of course, it's impossible to bring justice to, true justice, I guess, to what actually, happened on such a large, horrific scale in Asia.
I'll take you through the horror we forgot, what Imperial Japan actually did in the war. Then we'll look at forgive and forget, unless you're a German. Then we'll try to understand the European war popularity, as well as take a look at two specific concepts, nuclear sympathy and Cold War realities.
Okay. Interesting points. I think this is a really good outline here to look at these. Yeah, I'm definitely interested in hearing his take, and I'll let you know what I think.
To see how they shaped what we remember and what we never heard about World War II. Let's first take a look at the Pacific theater of World War II, where Japan's war machine killed up to 30 million people, most of them civilians. It includes millions of Chinese civilians, POWs, Korean slaves, whole towns wiped out. But it's not just the numbers that are horrific, it's also what they did to people before they killed them.
In the Nuremberg trials, not to bring up and try to keep so Eurocentric about it, they try to, in the prosecution, frame these as like, what did the judge say? Something like violence beyond necessity, trying to make them a more academic term for, this isn't just traditional deaths as a result of traditional warfare, but something much extra. And that definitely goes, into what happened here in Asia.
In 1937, Japanese troops rolled into China's capital and unleashed 6 weeks of sadism that we know as the Rape of Nanking. Right. They held public beheading contests to see who could kill the fastest. Soldiers raped women in front of their families, then carved them open with bayonets.
If you have read, or not read, I guess listened to any Dan Carlin heads out there, I'm actually still listening to it right now. That what's it called? Armageddon of the East or whatever. It's about Japan in World War II. Talks about a lot of these, famous stories, and the beheading thing being an interesting one that I guess seems to have happened, but also, not to lighten it, was hyperbolic to maybe what people thought the scale was versus how often and to what extent it happened. Truly horrifying, though.
Pregnant mothers were gutted. Infants were thrown in the air and caught on swords. One witness described a girl, no older than 9, raped by more than 20 men in a single night and then impaled with a bamboo spear. Estimates say between 200 and 300,000 people were slaughtered. It was so awful that even Nazis stationed in the city wrote panicked reports back to Berlin begging someone to intervene.
Yeah. That's before, the Holocaust and those atrocities that they're going to start doing. Yeah, there's this kind of routine thing set up by the Japanese military called comfort houses, where what he talked about with the women there was a routine thing. And inevitably, these women would contract a disease or obviously a pregnancy, and then were often executed at that point.
I mean, think about that for a moment. And Nanking wasn't even the worst of it. In northeast China, Japan set up a secret facility called Unit 731. It ran from the mid-1930s to the end of the war.
Earlier.
Inside, Japanese scientists, they dissected the victims alive with no anesthesia at different points during the disease to study its progression. They removed organs one by one to see how long a body could keep going. One case involved a frostbite experiment on a 3-day-old infant. Another used POWs to test flamethrowers and grenades. People's arms were frozen and shattered with hammers. Some prisoners were tied to stakes while plague bombs full of infected fleas were dropped overhead.
You guys probably heard about a lot of the denialism that came from that generation of Japanese citizens and things like that. Basically saying that stuff, never happened. And the current generations of Japan have it seems to have come to terms with at a much higher number than the previous generations about it. But basically denialism that, your people could do such things. Do you guys think denialism is still a major, problem for people to try to deal with or compartmentalize when you talk about the actions of your country?
And then hundreds of thousands of people, mainly Chinese, died from the plague bombs developed by that unit. The lab also used Russians, Koreans, and American POWs as test subjects, and virtually none of them survived. On a broader level, the Japanese military essentially industrialized sexual slavery. Around 200,000 women, mostly Korean and Chinese, were kidnapped or tricked into becoming comfort women. They were raped dozens of times a day, beaten, and worse. There's evidence of teenagers with shattered pelvises, girls who died from infection, suicide, or simple exhaustion. One survivor described being forced to service 40 men in 24 hours. And if you were a soldier captured by the Japanese, the outcome wasn't much better. On the Bataan Death March in 1942, Japanese guards bayoneted anyone who stumbled. Thousands died on the road. Those who made it to prison camps faced starvation, disease, beatings, and slave labor. Here's some perspective. The death rate for Allied POWs under Nazi control was about 4%. The death rate in Japanese custody, about 30%. And for Chinese soldiers, there were no POW camps at all because most were executed on the spot.
Carlin was talking about that too. And the thing that comes to mind when you talk about these atrocities, and we have these conversations in class, which is, how do normal people, right, seemingly normal people, at least were at some time, can come to do these types of atrocities, right? What type of brainwashing or desensitivity, really dehumanization, has to occur to have these things sort of happen? We know that dehumanization has been a byproduct of warfare forever, where you don't see the enemy as an equal person, I guess, to you. And a lot of that comes down to the whole survival idea where it's, us versus them. But it's that extra level, right, that we're talking about. And it brings in such an interesting discussion. And I think it still comes back to what's easy to do, which is just to write it off completely, that just those people are these outliers of, humanity. But I think it's actually more important to draw on these ideas that in history we have seen people that come from regular backgrounds that end up, doing horrible things for whatever reason it is. And I think that's an important discussion to sort of have about the dangers of how a society can, whether it's slowly or quickly, come to do atrocities that you normally wouldn't do. And then the important thing on top of that is, how can that happen? What are the ways in which that happens? So obviously we can identify those type of actions that could lead to such horrible consequences. What do you guys think? What is sort of, I guess, the path to this kind of dehumanization?
Germany's gas chambers became a symbol of industrial evil, but Japan's crimes were more intimate, physical, even gleeful. And behind all of this brutality was a culture that worshipped death over surrender. In the Pacific, less than 1% of Japanese troops allowed themselves to be captured. They fought to the death or took their own lives because they believed it was better to die than be taken alive.
And that's such a big part, I think, that can lead you to do these horrible war crimes. Is it's like if these soldiers are ordered to do these things, what it's actually telling them is, don't ever be a POW. It's going to be better for you to die, because look what happens in our camps. You don't want that to happen to you. I do think that's one of the processes that we saw in World War II that does kind of help explain that answer of why people might be doing horrific things, to teach you not to become a victim, because that would happen to you.
That belief was so deep that in places like Saipan, civilian families, including mothers with their kids in their arms, jumped off of cliffs rather than be captured. They'd been told that the Americans would torture and rape them. We have a first-hand account of some of that torture from Louis Zamperini. He was an Olympic track star who became a bombardier in the Pacific. His plane went down, and he spent 47 days at sea before Japanese forces picked him up and threw him in a prison camp.
I just watched this movie, I feel like a couple months ago. This was a movie, right? It was, but these Americans in a Japanese camp, and they're going to be there till the war ends, and how horrific it was. What was this movie called again? It was really good.
It was known as Execution Island. He was routinely starved and beaten. A sadistic commander named Watanabe made it his...
Remember this guy in the movie? If you guys saw this, I think it's that character. He was so... It's like oh my gosh, you hated this guy so bad. What's this movie called again? Remind me. And then definitely check it out. It was streaming somewhere, maybe Netflix or something, but...
Mission to break Zamperini and others. He beat him daily, sometimes punching him unconscious. He starved and humiliated him. One day, he ordered every man in the camp to punch Zamperini in the face over 200 times. Yeah. Zamperini was freed at the end of World War II after 2 years in captivity. He broke some rules, I remember, because they let him turned into a really amazing book called Unbroken.
They wanted to...
I have a link to that.
They wanted to make him kind of like this puppet, if I remember right. They were like, all right, we're going to let you talk to the media and stuff, and it helps you get out of the camp, but you're going to basically be like a propaganda piece. And I remember right, he refuses to, and then they just beat the crap out of him even more. Unbroken, is that what the movie was called?
Below. It was also turned into a movie directed by Angelina Jolie. And by the way, if the U.S. hadn't ended the war so quickly with atomic bombs, the Japanese had plans to murder every Allied POW in the country. And when it came to Japan, there essentially became a policy of forgive and forget. And most of the war criminals never faced any kind of reckoning.
Let's remember the context of the building up of the Japanese Empire and why at least they were marketing themselves in a certain way. It's called the Greater Asia Prosperity Sphere. Essentially what the Japanese were declaring is that they were liberating Asia from Western imperialism, the Western imperialism that had gone on for decades and even centuries in that point. Whether it's China, the Philippines, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, places that have been colonized by, again, the Westerners, and that they were going to be the liberators of those places. Problem is, there was such an incredible amount of brutality to the civilians there. Though in the Japanese eyes, they were maybe seen more as like collaborators, and they, however, I guess they want to justify it. But that was like the context of why the Japanese, that was like what they declared their mission was. They were going to be the, protectors of Asia.
After the war, top Nazi leaders were dragged into court, paraded before the world, hanged. Swastikas and other Nazi symbols are still banned in Germany. And Japan did have some war trials, but that ended up executing 7 people, including Tojo. But by 1958...
That's much fewer, with 7, he said, right? Let me go back.
But that ended up executing 7 people.
Yeah. Nuremberg trials had more than that. I'm trying to remember. I used to know the numbers off my head because I give this lesson, but I know more than that. At least over a dozen were getting death penalties. Some got life sentences. Some got less. Basically, it was what evidence could they bring that directly tied them to the decisions of the war crimes, or which people were just carrying out, I guess, orders. And that kind of ended up justifying the different levels of punishment for the individuals involved. But yeah, far less doing that with the Japanese. We also know, well, like the Germans as well, a lot of the leaders and a lot of those individuals did not, surrender. They committed suicide, to avoid a lot of this.
Including Tojo. But by 1958, every other convicted war criminal was set free. And some of the worst offenders were never even tried. Watanabe, the POW commander who tortured Zamperini, he was listed as number 23 on General MacArthur's most wanted criminals list. That list was public, his crimes were known. But he hid out for a few years, then reemerged in Japan as a free man, working in insurance. In 1998, he sat down for an interview where he didn't really feel sorry for anything, and he died at the age of 85 without ever seeing a hint of punishment. That was the pattern with a lot of the perpetrators. Unit 731's leadership was never prosecuted. In 1946, U.S. intelligence struck a secret deal and the scientists and leaders got full immunity in exchange for their germ warfare research.
What do you think the impact of World War I was on these post-war decisions for World War II? Right, we know with World War I that kind of the punishments and things that went down, especially on Germany, created a lot of resentment that is going to build into the hostilities of the Second World War. Do you think that doing some of this leniency was a way to try to avoid that type of thing going forward? Now, we know with after the war too, unlike World War I, the Allies are going to occupy these places, or at least very directly see their whole rebuilding. We know Germany gets divided into a bunch of different pieces. The Americans are going to take control of Japan, rewrite their constitution, take away their military, do all of that. You also saw a similar argument made in the American Civil War, which was that the Confederate leaders were pardoned after that. Was that in all these scenarios with World War II and say like the Civil War, was that a better pathway to a longer standing peace for the future? Now, we have had that after World War II. And I guess, does that justify maybe that some of these criminals and some of these atrocities got off lightly? I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
The data was classified and later used as a foundation for the U.S. bioweapons program. Emperor Hirohito, who presided over all of it, he got a pass as well. Right. General MacArthur said that if the U.S. arrested Hirohito, it would take 1 million troops to keep Japan from exploding. He also worried that the Soviets...
Because of the devout culture, of course, that they had towards their, God Emperor.
Hirohito, it would take 1 million troops.
You wanted to go after the Soviets and Koreans and Chinese, though.
He also worried that the Soviets might fill the vacuum. So Hirohito stayed on the throne, never testifying or standing trial. And as I mentioned, in 1975...
Also, a motivation for the United States using the atomic bombs before the Russians could complete their invasion of Japan. And they were starting to move into like Manchuria. They were starting their movement towards Japanese-held territories. And there seems to have been a motivation for the United States to try to complete that surrender without the Russians getting on Japanese soil, because they feared, again, we're fearing a post, war Soviet world. The mistrust of Stalin was already happening in the Potsdam Conference and Yalta and all this stuff. So that was the sort of context as part of that. All right, 75.
Never testifying or standing trial. And as I mentioned, in 1975, he took a goodwill tour to the United States and had a great time at Disneyland. I remember my dad telling me how wrong that felt at the time, especially because he had friends who died in that war. That's my dad on the right, and actually Louis Zamperini on the left, who became his friend later in life. No German leader could have pulled off a U.S. goodwill.
The guy was an Olympian.
Germany got never again, and the country spent decades apologizing, educating, and confronting its past.
And let's be honest, they're going to be forced to do that. the sort of denazification. But let's remember, they changed a lot of their institutions to be apologetic and educate and confront. But let's remember that some of the pro sentiments never left Germany. The pro-Nazi sentiments have never left. Obviously not on the scale that it was at its height, but the institutions, some of these institutions were changed.
Don't walk through Berlin without stumbling into a memorial. But Japan got a clean slate. And it's not just the Japanese public that moved on. Our memories of Americans and others throughout the world have gotten fuzzy too. Hey, I researched this deeply, but I'm not perfect.
Yeah.
If I made a mistake or left something important out, I'll correct it in the description box below.
It's going to be important as he frames this to talk about who are we talking about that's forgetting. For example, the Chinese sure didn't forget.
You can also find my source notes there as well. Okay, so what we remember often comes down to who tells the story.
Sure.
After World War II, for the American public, the main characters were in Europe. That was the war we recognized. I mean, the people were more culturally familiar. And
what would many Indians say about what happened with their famines and how they put blame on that for Churchill and the British? The people that the Soviet Union occupied and also treated horrifically as well. German civilians in Dresden, That's a good point. Who are we talking about here?
In Europe. That was the war we recognized. I mean, the people were more culturally familiar, and the places were more recognizable to us. Also, the Allies made filming Nazi atrocities a top priority. Military photographers shot hours of footage at concentration camps.
So documentation.
They showed piles of corpses, mass graves, gas chambers, and the living dead. Survivors told their stories on camera. The Allies recorded the horrors as evidence for war crimes and for our collective memory. But the Pacific Theater was different. It was jungle warfare with enemies that looked nothing like us. Photos and testimony from that time, they exist.
That's a good point. I haven't
the original
thought
film
about that
footage
as much.
is rare, and most of it shows a general aftermath, not the actual atrocities. Asian victims also didn't resonate the same way. Wartime propaganda dehumanized the entire region and race. Orientals was the term used to lump Chinese civilians and Japanese soldiers into one large, blurry category. And
remember, there was an anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States with Chinese Exclusion Act, the Boxer Rebellion. These are good points being made here.
Lumped Chinese civilians and Japanese soldiers into one large, blurry category, and it dulled the outrage. Americans didn't see Asians as fellow Westerners under siege. They saw a different battlefield, filled with people they didn't understand and that they just didn't care as much about.
Hey, and that was something I think that it kind of offended the Japanese, and you saw this after World War I, was not being seen as like equal partners when it comes to the West and who are like kind of the top dogs in this industrial imperial world. And they kind of took that sentiment after World War I, kind of not being being considered a part of that big kids table, if you will, and rode that into, their hostile imperialism after World War I.
For decades,
Which
U.S.
had already
history books
continued.
covered Pearl Harbor,
It already happened before the war.
Midway, and the atomic bombs in vivid detail. But we got maybe a sentence or two on Japanese aggression, even less about the horrors. Until the late 1990s, most Americans had never heard of Unit 731. When Iris Chang published The Rape of Nanking in 1997, it felt like a shocking expose because it was.
That's kind of the go-to, by the way, when you talk about war crimes of the Japanese, that book. Yeah, it's kind of the big one, the one you often start with when studying this part of the war.
The story had been missing from the syllabus for 50 years. Meanwhile, the Holocaust became a foundation of World War II education.
Sure.
Every American student knows the name Auschwitz and Dachau, but hardly anyone knows Pingfang, the town where Unit 731 operated.
Well, let's remember too how many people of Jewish, backgrounds, lived in the United States, immigrated to the United States. So you could hear these stories, all across the United States of people that were victims, of the Holocaust and had been able to escape death in a place like Auschwitz, right? You might have had someone that came to your elementary school and talked about it. Yeah, you definitely didn't happen to have that. Didn't have as nearly as many of those like victims, I guess, of what happened to the Chinese and other Asians in the United States as you did with Jewish victims. That's like, I think, a more literal, I guess, explanation for why there's that disparity.
Auschwitz and Dachau, but hardly anyone knows Pingfang, the town where Unit 731 operated. Another factor to consider is that most of Hollywood's powerful studio heads were Jewish immigrants, some of them refugees. Telling the story of Nazi evil was personal. So we got dozens of European war movies, Holocaust films, documentaries, and memoirs. Entire genres were built around it. By contrast, Pacific War films were rarer. Movies like Empire of the Sun or Unbroken came decades later, but few had the impact of the European War, and there was certainly never an equivalent Schindler's List. And
so basically the media, right? More media coverage. And not just the news, but in entertainment media, okay?
And that leads us to nuclear sympathy, which helped Japan pull off a rare transformation from brutal empire to global victim. In August 1945, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan, first on Hiroshima, then Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of people died instantly, and tens of thousands more suffered and died from radiation in the weeks that followed.
Ends up, when you add them up together, probably a good couple 100,000, probably, 200,000 people. Yeah, again, civilians in just single events. That's why it's seen as so catastrophic.
Those bombs didn't just end the war, they rewrote the story of what happened beforehand. The images of charred school children, shadows of vaporized bodies, and burned victims stumbling through rubble, they were unforgettable. And the country that butchered its way through Asia became seen by many as the first victim of nuclear war. And Japan leaned into that hard. Once the US occupation ended, the Japanese government built a national identity around peace and atomic suffering. Every August, Hiroshima hosts a solemn ceremony with speeches, lanterns, doves.
It's an original building that amazingly survived.
Every August, Hiroshima hosts.
I forget what that was. It was like an expo center. Okay, so this kind of dome building. It was amazing when you look at the photos of the aftermath right after the bomb, that this building was not laid to ashes like everyone else there. What was it again? It was like a civic center, an expo kind of center. This one in Hiroshima. Just recently, a friend of my friend JD of the History Underground did some travel there and documented some of that. Check out the History Underground if you haven't been. Awesome guy, great channel.
Solemn ceremony with speeches, lanterns, doves. It's treated as a uniquely tragic event in world history, which it is. But it also overshadows what Japan did before 1945. Even visiting diplomats follow the script. They lay wreaths at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, but it
doesn't overshadow for the places where the victims were of this, for sure. It didn't make the Chinese forget.
Even visiting diplomats follow the script.
But we are talking about the West
here. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, but they rarely acknowledge Japan's horror. And inside Japan, that narrative stuck as well. Surveys show citizens are far more likely to recall the fire bombings of Tokyo or the A-bomb attacks than any atrocities they committed.
Yeah, the fire bombings, by the way, that's honestly gone kind of under the radar, as well, as there were, more people that are going to die of these other attacks that were done by the Allies than just the bombs, the 2 atomic bombs. I mean, just the difference is just how powerful you're talking about with 2 bombs rather than a series of bombing and days of bombing like what happened in Tokyo.
When tough questions come up about Unit 731, comfort women, nanking, Japanese officials often pivot to Hiroshima, and it shifts the conversation from what we did to what was done to us. And as Cold War tensions rose, Japan's anti-nuclear stance, it won at moral points abroad.
By the way, Japan wanted, I guess, moral points too in being anti-communists. Hoping, I think, to get credit from the West of being anti-communist and showing, I guess, their concern when the Soviet Union, after the Russian Civil War, and you're going to get the establishment of the USSR. And then, of course, in China, which was also having a communist movement under the Communist Party under Mao Zedong, they were trying to also show themselves as anti-communists and being a justification for the occupying and maybe imposing regime changes as well.
A pacifist model. And over time, Western guilt about the nuclear bombs meant that victories over Europe was celebrated more often than that over Japan. The end result is that
I think that guilt level is a lot smaller than what we can really tie into that being a significant thing is like the atomic bomb guilt. I think that's still pretty minuscule when talking about why the Japanese war crimes have kind of swept under the rug, at least from the West. I don't know how big of a deal that is going to be, just kind of personally.
The world remembers the ending of the war more clearly than it remembers the beginning and the terrible middle. But
just because it doesn't matter when it was, And the atomic use of the atomic bombs was extremely popular amongst the American society at the time. And yeah, there's been a little bit more nuanced, I think, reaction to it these days, but I think it's still a majority opinion that it was the lesser, I guess, of evils for decisions that were needing to be made about how to end World War II. I think polling still shows that, right? Again, it's a lot more nuanced now. I've actually studied it in college. I remember doing a paper on the historiography of the responses to the atomic bomb, and just again how it changed. The kind of the narrative of it did change over time, and that was largely in kind of some academia styles or academia circles, but from the military perspective and the societal perspective, it's still been seen as a better alternative to what people thought could have been with the continuation of that war and a potential invasion of Japan.
After the war, why weren't more Japanese leaders prosecuted? Why did the emperor and so many others walk away free? It wasn't just niceness. The US was also becoming more strategic during the Cold War. After the surrender, America had to decide what kind of a Japan it wanted to help rebuild. Actually, at first, the US worked to demilitarize and democratize Japan.
Right.
They held trials, purged generals, and they wrote a new constitution.
You guys know that there's no Japanese military, not with any offensive capabilities. They have a small sort of defense force, but are still to this day not allowed to have kind of offensive powers. That the United States is basically the military for Japan, which, by the way, is going to be really beneficial for Japan economically. We don't have to spend the absurd amount of money it takes to build a national army of a country that size. You can invest a lot more in rebuilding your economy, and the Japanese economy does very well after. And that, I think, is going to be a part of it.
But by 1947, the priorities had flipped. Communism was spreading fast, and Washington decided Japan was more useful as a stable ally rather than a punished enemy.
That would have happened regardless. They were anti-communists, very outspoken against it too, but before the war.
Historians call it the reverse course. General MacArthur decided to protect the emperor, fast-track economic recovery, and stop arresting new war criminals. By 1948, the U.S. stopped additional prosecutions altogether, and by the early 1950s, most prisoners were paroled. And behind the scenes, the U.S. struck deals that would have been unthinkable in Europe. The Unit 731 scientists got immunity. The general who ran the unit was never punished, and some of his staff went on to become professors, researchers, and respected doctors. As I mentioned, the emperor was shielded, and a 1951 treaty forgave most reparations. A year later...
Man, that's another thing. Do you think that was influenced by World War I? We saw how damaging reparations were in World War I, creating more incentive for hostilities and resentment after the war. But, I mean, what ends up happening is the United States kind of takes over the economy here. They're going to become major trade partners. Same thing, of course, happens with Western Germany. Kind of become an economic extension of the United States.
Security Pact made Japan a key American ally. Purged war criminals quietly returned to power. Men who'd overseen slave labor and war campaigns now ran ministries and banks. Nobusuke Kishi, once arrested as a Class A war criminal, became Japan's prime minister in 1957. Within a few decades, the world saw Japan as the land of Toyotas and Walkmans as memories faded. Japan's national broadcaster issued textbook guidelines that forbade the phrase, "the rape of Nanking." It was part of a decades-long battle over how the war would be remembered.
It is interesting how in those curriculums, after about how the war was kind of seen in Japanese curriculums, how whitewashed it actually was going to continue. That was one thing that seemed like the Americans did not try to completely change institutionally, was what was going to happen in school curriculums when it comes to the history of the war.
Japan finally issued an apology in 1993, the Kono Statement, but it's been a political flashpoint ever since. Some Japanese leaders have walked it back, others have tried to erase it. A 2023 poll found that only 4% of Japanese under 30 years old had a correct estimate of the Nanking death toll. America cut deals and helped build a sanitized version of Japan's wartime history.
What percentage of Americans do you think know how many people died in the Holocaust? Again, you're talking about 11 million people.
One that was easy to work with and live with, and it worked.
Actually, the question shouldn't be how many Americans, how many Germans do you think today know about it? A much higher percentage probably than Americans do.
And look, it's not about keeping a scoreboard of evil, but there are millions of people who deserve to be remembered. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history in terms of absolute deaths. But as a percentage of humanity who was killed, other wars throughout history were substantially worse. And one thing difficult to see right now,
Mongol Wars, the percentage of people that died from Mongol wars was actually kind of around 10%, which again is like 3 times as much as World War II. That's scary to think about.
is that even with our ongoing wars that seem so awful, and they are, we're living in perhaps the greatest era of peace that humanity has ever seen. This video
Isn't that
may
amazing
open
to
your
think
eyes
about?
to get a better, more hopeful understanding of what our world is like.
Recency bias is obviously such a big deal when we compare the past to the present. But yeah, that's amazing. Now, one question we could ask ourselves, do you think, how much of that do you think is, of that peace is basically anchored by mutually assured destruction of atomic bombs? That's a great debate that we have in classes too, is about, you know, what can we say about the role of the existence of atomic bombs now, since we haven't had, you know, wars to this extent like we saw, you know, in World War II. All right, final thoughts. All right, that was another good video here from Elephants in Rooms. I think the points you made were all valid. I didn't disagree on, I think, the heart of any of the arguments he was making. Maybe I had a little bit more nuanced or put, you know, more or less emphasis on, I guess, the extent to which these things are reasons why the Japanese war crimes have kind of been forgotten. But overall, I think they were very just valid points there. So I don't know. What else do you guys think? What else do you think is missing, you think, from this discussion about the remembrance of Japan's role in World War II? Let me know down below. All right. See y'all next time.